Welcome to Supercool, the show about real-world climate solutions that cut carbon, boost the bottom line, and improve modern life. Each week on Supercool, we go behind the headlines to pinpoint the stories and data accelerating the low-carbon economy in towns and cities across the U.S. and around the globe. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. To stay up to date on Supercool, hit the follow button or subscribe button wherever you're listening. If you've tuned in to any news source over the past week, you've likely heard about DeepSeek, the Chinese AI company that seemingly has come out of nowhere and whose AI model is so disruptive and good that it's quickly jumped to number one in the Apple App Store. Not only is it good, it was allegedly developed for a tiny fraction of the cost of what ChatGPT and other US AI companies are spending to build their AI models. Not billions of dollars, but exactly $5.6 million to be precise. This potential, and I stress potential, paradigm shift into cheap AI has sent shockwaves across markets as seemingly everyone is trying to understand what just happened and what the implications may be. Today, we have the co-founder and chief technology officer of TeraWulf, one of the industry's best performing teams at the forefront of two digital trends. TeraWulf is building high performance compute data centers for AI and is also a large-scale Bitcoin miner. Now, the environmentalist in you might say, whoa, that puts TeraWulf in the crosshairs of critics who see Bitcoin mining and HPC AI as two of the most polluting, carbon-emitting, energy-intensive industries on Earth. But that is simply not a truth across the board. In the case of TeraWulf, the company operates on 91% zero-carbon energy, which comes predominantly from hydroelectric power. Yes, its Bitcoin operations and AI data centers are essentially powered by emissions-free flowing water. The company is also located on the site of a former coal mine on the western edge of New York State, which it retired, and which was the last operating coal mine in the state. Earlier this month, TeraWulf demolished the last standing smokestack, a 613-foot tall, vivid symbol of the new era of clean energy Bitcoin mining and clean energy AI data centers, which TeraWulf is helping to lead. My guest today is Nazar Khan, co-founder and chief technology officer of TeraWulf. Nazar has led the company's business strategy since day one. He oversees the development and implementation of TeraWulf's day-to-day operations, including hardware procurement, site evaluation, infrastructure build-out, and identification of future growth opportunities. Nazar walks us through TeraWulf's operations, how the company thinks about power generation and energy management, what's most important in building out new AI data centers, what the arrival of DeepSeek portends, and where all of this is headed. Here's my conversation with Nazar. Nazar, welcome to Supercool.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So as we came to understand the positioning of TeraWulf in the Bitcoin mining landscape and now moving into HPC AI compute and data center and how topical that is, how timely that is, just went from a business conversation, from a societal conversation. I was really excited to bring you on the show and get a chance to chat with you.
It's been quite a journey from where we started. For those folks, just a little bit of background. We started in the power space, and so we had a company called Beowulf Energy for 25 years. We developed, owned, operated, constructed, and managed power generation facilities, both thermal, renewable, domestically in the United States, as well as in overseas jurisdictions. So we really cut our teeth as developers and kind of repositioning assets. And so we are the ones that kind of come in, roll up our sleeves and figure out where to put power on the grid and where it was needed most. And so it was that kind of very detailed and nuanced understanding of how power works, how the grid works, what it needs, that led us to flip to the load side of the equation.
We're going to talk about how your team's been together for a very long time, which is really interesting. You've worked on, I think I heard your CEO say recently, together 5 gigawatt of energy together and energy infrastructure. So very, very experienced team that's been doing this for a long time. And the idea of how do we monetize power, all of that I find really fascinating. But before we jump into that, Nazar, what I'm interested in and what I find fascinating is the statement that TeraWulf makes about becoming the mission. So I'm just going to read this. TeraWulf's mission is to become the first ESG dedicated crypto mining company. And you can probably now add HPC AI compute into that as well. But where does that mission come from?
Yeah, I really think it comes from just the way the grid is transitioning. So when I started in the power space, late 90s, early 2000s, you had largely a thermal based generation stack. And people said, hey, we want to add renewables to the market. And you started to see the initial onset of wind and solar. And what's interesting about most renewable generation is that it has a zero marginal production cost. So when the wind blows and the sun shines, the cost to produce that power is effectively zero. There's a front end CapEx, and that CapEx has been coming down pretty significantly over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And so when you think about just the cost of generating electricity, that production with a zero marginal cost oftentimes is one of the lower cost sources of energy. Challenge with it can be zero carbon resources. If you have nuclear, that does have kind of a dispatch cost, right? It has a marginal production cost. Hydro, again, is another zero carbon resource that has very little or zero marginal production cost. But when you start to think about, how do you bring in zero marginal cost product? When you think about the way the grid works, most hours of the year, the grid is massively oversupplied. And when I say 2 a.m. on any given day, anywhere on the grid, there is an abundance of available energy. 2 p.m. may be a different question, but once you start to understand the value of having this kind of zero marginal cost product and being a user of it, you can effectively bring down your costs. And if you think about what we have done is we were in the power space, and when we flipped to being a load, it was really thinking about how do we best monetize the value of this energy or access to energy that we have. And that really comes through in this intersection of energy and data. And so we were kind of in the energy business. We were just putting power onto the grid on a wholesale basis. But if you think about where most of the value lies, the most valuable companies in the world are all data companies. And so we said, hey, if there's a way to more directly play at that intersection, we would likely be able to monetize the value of that energy in a better way. And so if you think about what Bitcoin mining is, I tell people that Bitcoin mining is the largest decentralized computational network in the world. It does one thing. You may or may not like what it does. I love it. I think it's great, but it's the largest decentralized computational network in the world. So when you think about, again, you're converting this kilowatt hour of electricity into hash, it's this form of data that now has value in every corner of the world. And so when you think about how do you do that effectively and efficiently, the low cost of power is critical to that. And so when we started to understand how Bitcoin mining worked, to me, it was kind of brilliant in that you had this extremely economic responsive load that was basically there to take advantage of these low priced hours. And as soon as power prices got high or the grid got tight, they would just not be there. So it wasn't adding to peak demand and therefore increasing kind of the marginal cost of energy for the broader grid as well. And so that's where we started when we pivoted from being a generator. And if you think about what AI is, it's simply an extension of that. People say, hey, it's a new business. I said, no, not really. It's just an extension, again, of playing at that intersection of energy and data. And now you have these loads that have different characteristics and profiles in terms of how they are intending to operate. Whether they will continue to operate like that, that's up for debate. But again, this was another large load that needed access to scaled power at a relatively low cost. Everyone's talking today about DeepSeek. And the big thing is, hey, this stuff is a lot cheaper than we thought. And I've always said that for AI to be as ubiquitous as people expect it to be used everywhere, all the time, and everything, it has to be cheap. It has to be very cheap for it to be as ubiquitous as people say it's going to be. So it shouldn't be surprising to folks that cost matters and that people are going to figure out a way to do this more cheaply. And so everything that we do, right, we always think about what's the cost of energy, what's our cost of construction, what is that we're building, so that at least in the part of the value chain that we drive, we've got a very clear idea of why we're spending money and what we're getting for it. So that's a little bit about our journey of starting in power side, moving to load side, and how that theme ties through both Bitcoin mining as well as AI HPC.
I've heard you talk about this before too, about having your roots as a power generator, right? So then you just say, okay, well, fundamentally, we are a power generating company. How do we maximize the value we get per kilowatt hour, per megawatt hour, whatever that might be? And if that journey takes us into Bitcoin, and as you said, whether you like it or don't like it, we're going to mine it and we can make money doing it. We're going to do that. We're going to look at HPC, AI compute. It's another revenue stream for us. We, TeraWulf, are fundamentally really good at generating power at a very low cost. and we're going to go down the path that's the most optimized for us to do that. And we're going to distill that because the role you sit in, I find very interesting as the COO, CTO working on strategy. So we're going to get into kind of nuts and bolts of how does this actually get done? Because it's also a very interesting question to us. We're talking about AI, we're talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about these digital properties, the digital future. But to get there, you need very physical infrastructure, right, to make that happen. So we find that pretty fascinating. But fundamentally still, why ESG? Why have this mandate? I know you're at Lake Mariner, you're in upstate New York, you have access to this hydro facility, but nonetheless, you could just have said, hey, whatever, we've got clean energy. Why have this very visible mission? What's the genesis of that? Is that something that you believe in? Is that something the team believes in? Like, where'd it come from?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the ethos of the company. And again, I think in today's discourse, some of these terms carry a weight of their own depending upon where you're coming from. But for us, fundamentally, it's really about how do we best position ourselves to be both, in a place where we as a business can be successful, profitable, but that we're also stewards for the broader community that we operate in. And so, for example, we used to own a coal-fired power plant at that site. We retired the very last coal-fired power plant in the state of New York. And we had a number of employees at that site who had been working there for 20, 30 years, whose kids had worked there. We were an integral part of the local community. And so on a broad scale, you may say, hey, that's great, you've retired a coal-fired power plant. But on a very micro scale, that was a devastating event for that local community. And so it's not that one is right or one is wrong. I mean, both can have merit. So it's really thinking about how do we do what we do in a way that, again, we're kind of contemplating and reflecting upon our role both as a business to be as profitable as possible, but also how are we stewards for kind of things happening around us. And so once you start to weed through what that means and how that works, it feeds into the ethos. And I'll just give you an example. Again, from an environmental perspective, we talk about the cost of power. I said oftentimes renewables are a zero marginal cost source of energy. And so that's why you see kind of these wild swings in the cost of energy. When the sun shines and the wind's blowing, the cost of power can come down meaningfully. You see in different parts of the country how they can have a very pronounced impact on the overall cost of electricity in the grid. And so if you can buy energy relatively cheap and create a product that's worth a lot, you can make a lot of money. But when you think about it more holistically, if you think about the grid, the energy grid, it is a socialized system. There's one grid in each region and territory that everyone uses. There's not multiple grids. You can say, hey, I don't want to use this one, let me use that one. There's one grid. We all chip in, we all pay for it, and we all get to use it. And the more money that we have to spend to make it stronger, more robust, more resilient, someone's got to pay for that. And ultimately, that's everybody. That's mom and pop, that's small businesses, medium businesses, commercial. I mean, everyone is a part of that. So again, our actions as a large load and what we're doing to the transmission system have a consequence beyond just the four corners of our site. And so we should be thinking about that. And if we're thinking about that in a way that's good for us, it could likely be good for those around us as well. So when you think about this, again, especially these days, don't get hung up on whatever that may mean to you, but really think about like what's the role that you have on what you're doing very directly and concretely. But then also when you start to look one and two kind of layers out, what ripple effects do your actions have on those around you? And again, once you start to think in that frame, this is where these themes really start to come out. And again, for us, we're very proud that half of the folks that were at our site when we retired the coal-fired power plant are our employees today. We hired them, we trained them, we brought them back, and we've made this site a point of excitement and joy for the local community. When all is said and done with our current AI build out, we'll have brought $3 to $4 billion worth of capital to that site in a relatively short period of time with no state subsidy, with no state really support, right? It's just kind of ingenuity. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that our ability to do all that is highly dependent upon each one of those folks at the site. What we get done at that site every single day is a testament to their ethic and their drive, because again, they deliver. Because they believe in what we're doing, they really believe in what they're doing. And so that compounds on itself. It's theirs just as much as it is ours. And so that ethos really strings through this concept of kind of ESG to us. And again, whatever you want to call it, from Paul through everybody else on the team, that really is the ethos of the business.
Yeah, I appreciate that sentiment. And one of the things that we see, we talk to a lot of companies that are working in infrastructure in some capacity. From our lens, right, if you're talking about moving to a low carbon economy, you're talking about the projects that have impact, have scale, and they're dealing in the physical world very often if we're
correct,
get to this future that we all aspire to. And I think one of the things that comes out is this ethos of we're in a real community, we're in a physical community. There are real lives that are being impacted here. And what you're sharing your story is unique to TeraWulf and how you do it. And I did see the video of the last smokestack, the
Stack coming
600
down.
smokestack. Yeah. The detonation and bringing that thing down. In some respects, I would say a very triumphant moment. Others might say, to your point, a little bit bittersweet. It's a marker, right, of the era that we're in.
Yeah, it was that stack was very symbolic of what the site is. To me, the symbolism really is that with ingenuity and with people, right, you don't have to be constrained or confined to doing one thing. And that was a landmark in the local area. So when I was 12, 15 miles away, I could see the stack and be like, hey, I'm almost home. Folks on the lake kind of knew where they were when they looked up at the stack. So again, it symbolizes something for the community. Eventually, that whole area is going to be covered in data centers. And so either we had to take it down today, or if we took it down in the future, we'd literally have to dismantle it by hand. And so the pragmatic thing to do was to bring it down. But I think it was very symbolic of this transition and journey that everybody at the site has really been through. And again, that really comes back to this ethos of how it is that we're entering this next phase. And you talked about the importance of technology, right? And when these intermittent resources called wind and solar really first came on, they were very expensive, right? The cost to produce them was fairly high. Those have come down very significantly, which is why on a levelized basis per unit, the cost of that is getting to be, the lowest, if not the lowest. And so the challenge, however, is they don't run all the time. Like if you got a load that wants to run 24/7, akin to a data AI load, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day and the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. So then how do you now marry that kind of a load profile with this zero carbon, low cost resource? I don't know if there's a single silver bullet that says you just do SMRs or you do more nuke or you do this or you do that or batteries. I mean, I think all of the above are necessary. And it's also very important to think about where you're doing this. The solutions we come up in upstate New York can be very different than the solutions we have in Arizona. There's just different climate, different topology, and different resources available. And so each area is going to have its own set of kind of physical characteristics, which will then drive what that solution looks like. And the one piece that we've been hammering home, and I've really been pushing our clients and customers, is that when you think about balancing supply and demand, and we've always focused on the supply side to be able to ramp up and down to meet the changing demand.
If you energy, we're talking about.
Yeah. So if you have a dispatchable resource, when everyone goes to bed, you basically just turn those gas and coal plants down, and then you ramp them back up in the morning when everyone wakes up. And so it was a more simple kind of equation. You understood what the load was. And so now when you start to get into these resources that aren't there all the time, they're not the same every day. Some days it's cloudy, some days it's really sunny, some days the wind's blowing not at all, some days it's really blowing. And so now you start to have these supply side resources that are not really dispatchable. The last thing that you want to do when they are running is to not use that power. And then you have this demand profile. As we transition, there's this next phase of technology is really going to be driven around a dispatchable load. And if you think about what Bitcoin mining has done, and I tell people that the brilliance of Bitcoin mining is that it is the most economically responsive dispatchable load that exists. The way Bitcoin mining works is in every 10 minutes, there's a block reward. And every 10 minutes, you know exactly what your economics are. You know what the price of Bitcoin is, you know what your cost of power is, you know what the network hash rate is, you know how much hash rate you're putting up there. It's all math. And you know whether you're in the money or you're out of the money. And so when power prices get really high, you're usually out of the money and you say, hey, we're not going to run, we're going to curtail. And so it's the most economically responsive load. So as you think about, again, how do we move into this era where this intersection of energy and data is going to become more pronounced? And again, whatever your forecasts are on how much power is needed, it's likely more than is being used today. And we can all debate and discuss and say it's 2 gigs, 10 gigs, 50 gigs. I don't know what the number is, but I do know that it's likely going to be more than what exists today. And so when we're doing that, I think there also needs to be this heavy focus on understanding how these AI loads behave and how they are also integrated to the grid and are responsive to it. And that's just that's a tech piece, right? It's really a technology. And that's how folks that you can't tell me on one hand that AI is going to take everyone's jobs and take over the world, but on the other hand, tell me that it can't be responsive to changes in the grid, that it has to run.
Okay, hold on. Let me just help me understand, Nazar, the value in having that almost real-time demand response to say we can either turn on or we can turn on as a miner, right? As a Bitcoin miner, and maybe it's the same for I don't know the dynamics of value. But what's the value? Yeah, why is that a good thing?
The way the grid works is it needs to meet peak demand plus some sort of margin, and peak demand only occurs 50, 100, 200 hours in the year. There's 8,760 hours in the year. As I said earlier, at 2 a.m. on any given day, everywhere in the country, the system is massively oversupplied. And so the example I like to use is that if there was a load that said, I'm going to run from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. every single day, and I need 2 gigawatts of power tomorrow, there's a lot of places that could give it to you. You can only run from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. But again, because it's taking power when there's no other real demand, there's plenty available. And so what we really need to think about not is just kind of total power that's needed, but when that power is needed and how it's impacting peak demand. And so when we run Bitcoin mines, and we were very out there with the local utility, with the grid operator, saying that we will not be adding to peak demand in any way, shape, or form, right? Because by definition, if we're consuming power when peak demand is occurring, the price of power is going to be the highest it's been that day, that week, that month.
And so will emissions, right? Because you got to fire up
because you're marginal. So if we're not impacting peak demand and we're filling in everything else, and like I said, when you think about the number of hours in the year where the system is oversupplied, the vast majority of hours in the year, the system is oversupplied. It's only 5-10% max of the hours a year that the system is tight. So now if you can build loads that know they can run 60, 70, 80% of the time and don't run at those times, the amount of new stuff we have to build goes down significantly. Transmission, power generation stations. And who pays for all that? We all do. Because again, when you think about the transmission system, any incremental dollar that's invested in transmission system is allocated to everybody.
Yes. Okay.
So, and then also from a power perspective, right? When you start to impact peak demand, and to your point, then the least efficient generators come online, that's also raising the price of power for everybody. Because if you're a mom and a pop, you're still going to be consuming power when it's the hottest day in August and the coldest day in February, right? Because you need heat. Your load is likely not that responsive. If anything, it's kind of coincident with the load in general. And so you don't have the flexibility to curtail. But these other types of loads should have that embedded within it. And historically, if you look at where the data center world has come from, it's taken this view that we need power all the time and we'll pay whatever we need to for it. Right? It was just a relatively small part of their overall cost basis. So they said, we got a lot of money. That's not the issue. Just tell us what we got to pay. We'll pay it, but we want it. And now I think as we move forward, and again, depending upon whatever your forecasts are, I think, and regardless of how big you think it's going to be, I think over time, these loads are going to have to think about being more responsive. Again, will they ever be akin to a Bitcoin mining load and be that responsive? Maybe not, but they're going to have to be more responsive than they have been. And for example, a lot of data centers have on-site diesel generator backups. They spend a couple $1 million a megawatt to put 72 hours of diesel on-site just in case the power from the grid goes down. To me, that is a complete waste. The idea that every single incremental load of AI demand is going to need that kind of a backup, to me is, again, someone's got to pay for that, whether it's your customer. Somewhere along the way, people are paying for that. And again, those smaller generator backups are also less efficient. I just don't see physically how you do it, A, and then 2, you're not really getting what you're paying for. And again, if you think about what I said earlier, is that ultimately, if this is going to be as ubiquitous as people say, it has to be cheap. And if you're just having a $2 million per megawatt in your budget just for this, just in case, to me, it makes no sense. And so this is, I think, a live question that's been debated. I've been told plenty of times, I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe that's the case. But I tell them likewise, it used to be that the data center world and the power world would think about these things independently. And now ever increasingly, we're having to coordinate. And in that coordination, more likely than not, things will change, right? I mean, different perspectives will come in. And when you bring them together, things will change. And so again, that's just another example of, as we think about how all this plays out, having that general ethos of thinking through what's the cost or the impacts more broadly, and how do we deliver that? You know, all of it, we think, accrues to the betterment of the business itself that we're running. Right, we're come off faster online, we have access to more power, and we actually get cheaper power because, again, we're cognizant of the role that we play in the broader kind of system that we're operating in.
I appreciate you digging into that. I want to move on, but I also want to just make the point that from what you're saying is we used to live in a world where a company needed a data center is not as material to their ultimate balance sheet. So it's like, whatever, like, if we're paying a little bit of peak or we need a little bit of backup, no big deal. But now when you're talking about hundreds of billions and ultimately probably trillions of dollars are going to be outlaid on this in the near future, it's so sizable that all of that becomes material very, very quickly. And in a transmission system that impacts everyone, the role that Bitcoin miners and as you, TeraWulf, move into data center and HPC AI compute, this is something that you're very cognizant of. Okay.
And again, even within that, will there be certain loads that require that? Sure. But it's not going to be 100%. Could you say 5% or 10% needed? I could be convinced of that. But to say that 100% of the incremental load will need it makes no sense to me. So that's where, again, it's not a binary yes or no. To me, there's a pretty high bar that you have to justify in terms of showing why you actually need it and why it's worth it.
Okay. I want to switch gears. I want to talk about the relationship that you now have in place with Core 42 as you're moving into high performance computing and AI infrastructure, signing this agreement with them to set up to take your power and have them come in, run a data center. One of the things that I'm curious about, going back to this question of needing the infrastructure in place to run AI, to build up this part of the economy, is the supply chain. And what I mean by that is I was listening to a conversation that your executive team was having with Cantor a couple of weeks ago. And the question was, you guys have X number of megawatts available, 40, 80, 100, whatever the number is. And the question was something to the effect of how fast are you going to expand it? And your answer, Nazar, was, look, let's just hold on a second. It takes us, these projects could take 9 to 12 months to build out. I want to talk about that. But the GPUs that everybody wants from NVIDIA, the Blackhawks, whatever, like it's not just like they're showing up at everyone's doorstep tomorrow. There's a ramp up period for people to get to these massive 300, 400 megawatts. So that was really interesting to me, just understanding the timeline. But what I wanted to understand, because you said, look, if we're going to go build data center infrastructure, there's a 2 to 3 month design engineering phase, there's a procurement phase. But what I'm curious about is procurement. And what I'm interested in is, for the supply chain, is it like robust? Is there just like, I make a call, I got all these vendors who can deliver the racks, or I don't even know what goes in that center, like what that all means, but give us a picture, because we don't really know. Like the general public, like nobody knows what is in like one of these AI centers that is like so paramountly important to the future. So give us some color there.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm going to overly simplify just so kind of create some context for what we do. Very simplistically, when we put up a Bitcoin mine, we put up a building, it's air cooled. And so we basically use airflow to evacuate hot air. And we basically get these shoebox type boxes called ASICs, which are computers. They're 3,200 watts each. They blow a lot of hot air. And so the job of the mine is how many of those boxes can you fit in as small a place as possible and evacuate that hot air so you have no impact on the efficiency of the computer that you're running. And this gets back to this, efficiency matters, right? So you don't want to have to provide 5,000 watts of power to this 3,200 watt machine and have 1,800 extra watts of power that's used to cool. Because again, if you can get away with just using the air, that's going to be far more efficient, right? So this efficiency factor is important both in Bitcoin mining, and then as you look at the AI kind of data center world, it's the same concept, right? Again, you have way more sophisticated machines, you have a significantly higher density of power, the equipment costs a lot more, but again, fundamentally, bringing in something into a building, it generates a tremendous amount of heat, and our job in providing the infrastructure is really how do we manage that heat? And given where the density of racks are going, it's migrated from an air-cooled, again, where even data centers 10 years ago were largely air-cooled, to now liquid-cooled, right? So we have massive kind of chillers and coolers and pumps moving water to be able to use that as a cooling mechanism. And when you think about our site and compare it to a site in Texas, for example, we should be more efficient in being able to evacuate that heat, because at our site, we haven't gone over 100 degrees in the history of the site. I mean, literally, we're on the shores of Lake Ontario. We have our own microclimate even 5 miles away from where we are. In the summertime, it can be 5 or 8 degrees warmer. But where we sit, literally on the shore of Lake Ontario, our site's never registered a day over 100 degrees. And so if you compare that to now Texas, for example, they've got plenty of days over 100 degrees. And on those 100-degree days, the amount of energy they need to cool that very same equipment is going to be higher. It's just the ambient conditions are warmer, so therefore they're going to use more energy to do so. So our job really is, with our partner Core 42, is we're the infrastructure experts, and our job is to design a building where they can bring their racks in, they can operate those racks in the most efficient way. And we're doing our job in evacuating that heat and kind of balancing it out and using and being most efficient in how we're cooling that. And we've got parameters set that say, hey, we need to be this efficient. And if we're not that efficient, we pay for that, right? So we've got a direct consequence for not being that efficient. And so our interests are aligned. We want to deliver to them an efficient operations. They want to operate and maximize the use of that computational power that they have. And we've got parameters on which we're delivering that space. And so within that supply chain, right, there's a big electrical component. Obviously, you need power, so you need medium, low voltage transformers, switch gears, distribution panels. And then there's a whole mechanical piece around bringing that liquid cooling. We do direct-to-chip liquid cooling. So there's a whole mechanical loop that, again, is pulling water through to the chip and then recirculating that water, cooling it back down and bringing it back in, right? So we've got a whole kind of chiller and cooler kind of system. And so all of the procurement is really around that. And so, yeah, it's a very robust supply chain. When we go out to bid, there's half a dozen different vendors for different parts of that we go out to. And over time, right, our goal over time is that the more we do this, right, we're doing our first 2 buildings as we speak. And once we get to the 5th and 6th building, that design scope gets pretty tight. And if you think about what we're building today, we're building what we hope to be a data center that can live through the increasing density, power density that NVIDIA, AMD, and others are road mapping that they're going to put out there over time. And so the challenge that a lot of older data centers have is that they were built to meet 20 and 30 kilowatt per rack loads. We're already at 120 to 130 today, and we're going to 200 plus. And so we're designing for kind of 200 plus. And so again, this kind of gets into this efficiency. You know, we're going to be able to operate the most kind of those server racks with those GPUs in kind of the tightest space and have the most efficient kind of cooling associated with that. And so that's where a lot of work goes into. And I think these types of data centers, I'd say it's only been over the last 18 or 24 months that I would say that they really hit scale in terms of kind of their deployment. And so in some sense, we're all trying to figure it out. And so to anyone who says, oh yeah, this is exactly how you do it, you know, they're probably not right. We have a design that we think is wonderful and great. I would be shocked if we didn't find half a dozen ways to make it better on the next go round. And I tell my team that. I say, hey, if you don't find 6 new ways after we've actually delivered a facility and have it up and running, and you can't tell me 6 ways we can improve upon it, like we're not really pushing ourselves. So that's where over time, those folks that are building, I think, are going to have a significant advantage because they're going to be able to deploy and learn. And the speed and scale at which this is happening is very fast. And so that time is important. And so as we look out just in terms of where people are and the use of this computational capacity as well, I think we're probably 12 to 24 months out from hitting kind of this inflection point, right? Because again, a lot of that capacity that people have talked about isn't even installed and deployed today. 3 months from now, it's going to be different. At the end of the year, it's going to be very different. But sitting here today, a lot of that capacity that people are talking about is not even deployed yet. And so once that gets deployed, there's going to be a tremendous amount of discovery that happens that's going to impact every part of that value chain. How the compute is used, how it's monetized, how to make it run most efficiently, where to do certain things, how to manage these loads, how to design the buildings. I mean, every phase of that value chain is going to get better, and it's going to get better quickly because there is a real and direct consequence of figuring that all out. So that's, again, where we sit in that. And so, again, when people say they're going to put up 500 megawatts or 1,000 megawatts in a year, if they do it, I'd praise them all day long because that is a massive undertaking. And the amount of work and coordination that's required to deliver 1,000 megawatts of load at one place is mind-blowing. Again, people are doing all sorts of wonderful and amazing things. Our view has been, hey, to get to 500, we got to do 20, then 50, then 100, then 150, 175. I mean, let's do our thing, get it up, get it running, learn, reiterate, go back, do it again, do it better, and keep going. And then hopefully we'll get to this point where we can kind of scale it more quickly. But that's, I think, 12, 18 months out. It's not today. So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of what that supply chain looks like and how we think about bringing all this together.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that. I think the fundamental thing that you need to be able to do extremely well, and on top of all these things, is evacuate the heat, clear out the heat. And I don't know, that gives me a really interesting frame to think about. Therefore, like, how does all of this complex, sophisticated operation happen to be able to do that? Because evacuating the heat efficiently is how we're going to actually keep costs down and run the most world-class operation we possibly can. The other thing that I didn't appreciate, and I do understand what you're saying, is that many data centers have been around for years, and those data centers that are 20, 30, 40 years old, they've got a big problem, right? They're not capable of just only saying, oh, let's just throw the GPUs in that old data set. They're not even close to being set up to be able to operate at the kind of, I guess, the kilowatt hour the intensity that you described, right, to be able to serve this type of need. I didn't have an understanding or appreciation of that. So it's really, even though you can say, well, data centers have been around forever, it's like, well, yes and no, not for the infrastructure that needs now to go into place for what the future requires.
And then that's why even with the news around DeepSeek and saying, okay, hey, maybe we don't need as much power as people thought, which again, my view has always been, it's very difficult to extrapolate out on a straight line. The world doesn't really work that way, but it looks good on the spreadsheet and it's easier to do. And so people do it. But the reality is lines usually don't go straight. There's not a fixed annual CAGR that just multiplies year over year, right? So people are saying, hey, maybe we don't need as much power. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But within that though, even within that, this idea that if we don't need any more power, that the existing footprint of data centers can support what needs to be done is not true. Because again, a large chunk of that existing supply base is designed, is air cooled, and is designed to meet a significantly lower density of power at the rack. And so either those data centers need to shut down and retrofit, which just means that capacity is going to go offline. It's going to take them 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, whatever it is to get back to the place. But there's going to be kind of movement, and more likely than not, 100% of that older capacity is not going to shut down because there's still uses for it. So it's not that they don't need them anymore. They absolutely do. So there's going to be this need that we still see. And so at least in the near term, 6 or 12 months out, what we see is at least the folks that we're talking to, nothing's really changed from last Monday to today. They're still looking to get that capacity up. What that looks like 3-4 years out, again, it'll change, and it'll likely change a number of times between now and that time anyways, right? Whatever we think today is likely not going to be what we think a year from now either. So yeah, so there's a lot of rotation that's happening in space that people, don't fully appreciate. And again, these undertakings to deliver this capacity is also, again, today we probably got over 100 people on site doing all sorts of various things, building away. And so the amount of kind of work that's done both before you actually put the shovel in the ground and do stuff to when you actually have things on the ground. And then even afterwards, once we have the data center up and running and we have all of the server racks in the space, it's going to take us probably anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to tune the system to be able to run in the most efficient way. Right? Because think about it, you're running tens and thousands of GPUs, you want to be able to run them in parallel. And so there's a whole exercise that's required. So now how do you get all of these things to run in parallel so they can do the same thing and be thinking about or solving the same problem? That doesn't happen with the flip of a switch either, right? And that's literally a 4 to 8 week period to tune all of these computers to be able to do that. So once you start to lay out each kind of piece of this, the scale and the kind of work that's required is pretty significant. And like I said, inevitably, as we do more and more of this, people are going to figure out things that they didn't think about, going to have ways to do it more efficiently, quickly. There's going to be, and I tell my kids this all the time, I say, life is all about trade-offs. There's no decision that's just perfect in and of itself. There's always, you get something, but there's probably something that you're missing, right? So there's always a trade-off. And in engineering, it's no different. It's about trade-offs. There's no perfect solution to anything, especially if you have cost and kind of efficiency considerations. So again, understanding what those trade-offs are and where you want to calibrate on those trade-offs, again, is a never-ending exercise. And so that's, again, what goes into building these things that I think, again, is often overlooked. They just think of a box as a box. You put a bunch of GPUs in there and they run. I mean, yes, but what goes into that is also pretty complex and sophisticated. And like I said, there's 101 decisions that make our data center what it is versus someone else. Again, someone else may have different decisions for different reasons. We both may be doing what makes sense, but we may come to different conclusions on certain components of it. So I think, again, as we go through this, that's going to become more and more apparent as people think about what is that data center, what is it doing, what is it used for, what is its best use for, because not every data center is going to be perfect for everything.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that insight. Your comments on DeepSeek, I find that interesting too. And of course I was going to ask you about it since it's just so timely, but your point, I think you've made a couple points. You're like, one, if AI is ultimately going to be as ubiquitous as we all hope, anticipate, expect, there's no way that it has to get cheaper. And so this is just on that sort of that paradigm. But at the same time, you have infrastructure that's outdated. Regardless, you need new data centers to handle what that energy demand is going to be, even if it is getting cheaper, even if this is going to be a shift. My thought was, and I think you mentioned it as well, Nazar, was that, okay, here along comes DeepSeek, and suddenly it's like, whoa, there's a reaction. It's probably a bit of an overreaction. Who knows? But there's hype, there's reality. We don't fully necessarily know yet. And then something will come along after DeepSeek. And so that's just the paradigm that you're operating in. And so I was going to ask you, I think you've addressed it, is how do you operate in this landscape of, call whatever term you want, but it's on the bleeding edge, right? You're at the edge of the future, and it's your job to be head of strategy and to prepare the company. Now, and I know, like, I've heard your presentations about, we think there's this awesome future in AI compute. We're probably going that way, but we're still mining. That can be a part of our future. We're going to see how this all nets out, and we have optionality, which sounds like that's a big piece of how you think about the future, with a fundamental point of view of, like, we're going to make as much energy, as much money as we can delivering power, because we've been doing that for 15 to 20 years, and we probably know how to do that just about better than anyone else on the planet.
Yeah, and I think you use the word overreaction, and I was texting with some friends, and I called it the overreaction to the overreaction to the overreaction. A week ago, we had an announcement. We had a group of companies say they're going to spend $500 billion, and they were so far ahead that no one could ever catch up with them. They had so much money. They're at the White House. And so they were like, everyone's like, holy crap, they've got $500 billion. How's anyone ever going to catch up to them? So again, the speed at which capital flows is very fast. And so people just extrapolate out from a data point, they extrapolate out in some straight line, and you get to a conclusion that ends up very different from where you are today. And so, yes, I think the challenge exists that if you just react every time to something like this comes out, you probably end up nowhere.
Yeah, there you go.
Nowhere, because you're just like paralysis and like, oh.
Right.
And so what I tell people is, I don't know everything. I know our site. I know what we can do, and I know what we can deliver. And in that context, the decisions that we make are tied to our capabilities, our expertise, and what we think we can deliver upon. Does that work for everybody? I don't know. Does that work for somebody? Maybe. But I'm not trying to answer that for everybody. I'm just trying to answer it for what we know. And that site that we have, I know that site more intimately than anyone else in this world. Like, I'm certain of that. I'm dead certain of that, just because of my background in history. Not that I'm smarter, just that's what I've been doing for a long time, and that's all I spend my time thinking about. So what we can do at that site, the game plan and the roadmap that we lay out, is really a function of who we are, a frank assessment of what our capabilities are, and our ability to deliver upon that. And so if you look at what we said, hey, we just signed a deal for 72.5 megawatts gross, 60 net. Some people said, hey, that's not a lot. I said, I don't know, it's a lot to me. We haven't done it before, so let us deliver on that 60. And once we do it, then maybe the next one round will be 100 or 150. Once we do that, maybe we'll do 300. But I'm not going to jump from 0 to 300 in this space that has 101 different things that kind of go into making it right. So for us, maybe that's what's better for someone else. But for us, again, you got to do 20 before you do 50, before you do 100. That's a roadmap that we're on. I believe that the relationships that we have with our counterparty, Core 42, they're a partner. We think of them as a partner. They think of us as a partner. We go back and forth on all sorts of different things all the time. And that integration of knowledge and that learning, I think, is going to be invaluable for both of us. And so that's, again, what we do as a function of, again, what I think we can do at the sites that we have. And we hope that others buy into that vision and kind of support us as well. And I think, to your point, that with all of this kind of to and fro, the team that you're backing, and again, our team has been together for 25 plus years. Paul and I sat 10 feet away from each other until COVID hit, and that kind of shook things up a little bit. But that intimacy that we have from Paul, Carrie, Patrick, the entire team, feeds into our ability to think of what we're going to do, implement, and execute. And every single individual in the team has an important kind of part and role that we do in all that. And so again, our hope is that when people look at what we say, we deliver on what we say, we follow through on it. Again, it may or may not be at any moment kind of what people want to hear, but it's what we think is feasible, possible, and executable. And that's, again, that's all I can control. And so that's what we're going to go out there and do.
All of this conversation we're having is really about where society is going, civilization is going. And to think that from our perspective, from the Supercool perspective, that this is happening on a predominantly almost zero carbon infrastructure around hydropower, some nuclear, but to think that like all of this is still tied to a future where, all of this innovation can be delivered in a low carbon way that takes us forward. I just love that. And it's like, there's so much happening. We're doing it the right way because the story is, here's how we actually have to get it done.
Yeah.
Right? And so I appreciate you just taking time to walk us through and our audience through the operationally, what does it look like on the Lake Mariner site? How do you get a data server? What goes into that? Really some of the nuts and bolts. It's so interesting and so important that all of us have an understanding of it. So thank you, Nazar. Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. And hopefully it spurs discussion on your end as well. Because again, the other thing I tell people is that there's no simple answer to any of this, right? Because it has so many different variables that feed into each other and are dependent upon one another. There's an iterative discussion that occurs. And so the hope that we have is as we go about things, right? Anytime I bring someone on the site, I'm always like, listen, I want you to tell me what you love, what you hate, what you like. Because it's through that discussion that you can really start to understand how people are coming at what they're coming at. Doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. No, absolutely not. But it's more about just understanding all these different variables. And again, people will have different weightings on different variables. And so again, it's not to say that our weighting is a right weighting or it's a wrong weighting. It's more that just having that understanding, I think, leads to a better kind of total outcome if you're starting to think about all of those things in a more holistic way rather than just having one variable only and saying, hey, this is it, this is the way. So again, if you see what we do, a lot of that is also just a function of having that confidence and being able to take feedback and input from those that may not be, inside, and really figuring out if there's a way to incorporate it, if it should be incorporated. And again, hopefully on the back end, the stuff that you see is a result of all of that. Again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Look forward to being here again. And again, hope if there's any questions that any of the listeners have, send them our way and we'll do what we can to give them some context and feedback as well.
Awesome. Will do. Thanks again, Nazar.